Colleagues, good afternoon. We are starting the press conference by the Governor of the Bank of Russia, Elvira Nabiullina, and the Deputy Governor, Alexei Sabotkin. And to begin with, we'll hear the statement following the Board of Directors meeting. Good afternoon. Today, we have made the decision to keep the key rate at 21% per annum. Current price growth rates are going down gradually, which is largely the result of the Bank of Russia's restrictive monetary policy. The slowdown in inflation has also been promoted by improved sentiment in the markets and a stronger ruble. Nevertheless, price pressures remain high, and inflation expectations are still elevated. Hence, we need to maintain tight monetary conditions for a long period. Our further decisions will depend on how fast and sustainably inflation is decelerating and whether this is sufficient to bring it back to 4% in 2026. If not, we may additionally raise the key rate, although the probability of such a move has softened. I would now dwell on the reasons behind our today's decision. Firstly, inflation stays high. To a great extent, the high rate is explained by persistent demand-side pressures, which is most obvious from the underlying measures of inflation. Although core inflation is decelerating, it stays close to 10%. At the same time, current price growth has been gradually slowing down since the beginning of the year. And while price growth remains high in services and the food segment, non-food inflation has decelerated to moderate rates. In the first place, this slowdown has become evident in the segment of durables, namely cars, household appliances and furniture. Prices in these categories are most responsive to monetary policy and the exchange rate. A reduction in sales in these segments, which is confirmed by recent monitoring of businesses, also proves the effects on monetary policy. Companies report a rise in the stocks of electronic devices and cars. In other words, retailers expected higher demand than is currently observed. Alongside our monetary policy, price dynamics have also been affected by a stronger ruble. Further developments in the foreign exchange market will depend on actual changes in the external environment. It would be now premature to draw any conclusions about how strongly this factor might influence future inflation dynamics. Households' inflation expectations have continued to trend downwards in March, decreasing to 12.9%, which is the lowest level since last September. The decline in companies' price expectations has accelerated. However, inflation expectations are still elevated, which is preventing inflation from decelerating faster. Secondly, the economy. At the beginning of the year, economic activity slowed down slightly compared to the end of 2024. This is in line with our February forecast. Nevertheless, consumer activity remained high in January, additionally driven by a faster increase in wages at the end of 2024. This acceleration was associated with earlier bonus payments that some companies made in December 2024 instead of Q1 25 due to tax changes. This is why it will only be possible to assess wage dynamics more accurately after we receive the statistics for Q2 25. Preliminary data on consumption in February and March are mixed. There are the first signs of a moderation in investment demand. In particular, we have been recording a reduction in sales of freight vehicles and the demand for construction materials. Increasingly more companies are postponing their investment projects. Nevertheless, they do not suspend the projects launched earlier, which is possible due to the profit accumulated over previous years, among other things. As of the end of 2024, companies' profits declined. However, compared to historical levels, the amount of profit is rather high, both in the economy as a whole and in most of industries. Now this profit may be a source of financing for current investment projects. The labor market remains tight, although there are now more signs of decreasing labor shortages. This is confirmed by recent monitoring of businesses. In addition, the number of CVs submitted per one vacancy has been growing. The signs of a moderate slowing down in domestic demand growth and a gradual easing in the labor market indicate that the economy is rather on a soft landing path without sharp fluctuations. Thirdly, monetary conditions. Price monetary conditions have eased slightly, whereas non-price conditions have remained tight. Yield curves in the money market and the government bond market have shifted downwards, affected by market participants' expectations of a possible improvement of the geopolitical situations. Furthermore, nominal interest rates in many segments have notably decreased. However, considering the simultaneous decline in inflation expectations, monetary conditions in real terms have changed not that significantly. Lending amounts have changed more substantially in both the retail and corporate segments. The slowdown has been most pronounced in consumer lending, primarily in unsecured lending. Corporate lending has been expanding at a moderate pace, but its dynamics have been blurred due to elevated budget expenditures in the beginning of the year. Many companies use the funds received from the budget to repay the loans raised earlier. Overall, lending growth rates are close to the lower bound of our baseline forecast. In recent months, lending growth rates have been notably below the last year's peaks. However, this cannot be interpreted as a continuing tightening of monetary conditions because demand is affected not only by lending but also by budget payments. I would like to remind you that the resulting indicator characterizing the combined effect of credit and budget funds is money supply. In February, its expansion slowed down, albeit not as appreciably as in lending, which was because budget expenditures remained high. I would briefly talk of the budget. Budget expenditures were elevated in January and February, as was explained by the Ministry of Finance that was associated with earlier financing of expenses and advance payments under government contracts at the beginning of the year. The Ministry of Finance is nonetheless determined to decrease the structural primary deficit to zero by the end of 2025, which implies a gradual deceleration of budget spending to the seasonal norm in the coming months. We take it into account and assume that the budget will have a disinflationary effect this year. Now I would like to speak of external conditions. Export dynamics have been rather stable in recent months, whereas the expansion of imports has been decelerating due to restrictive monetary policy. As a result, the surplus of the balance of trade has increased, which, among other things, has strengthened the ruble. Overall, ruble assets have become more attractive owing to sustainably high yields in rubles and a more positive estimate of geopolitical risks by market players. Nevertheless, it would be premature to predict how stable the changes in external conditions will be. As regards risks to the baseline scenario, the balance of risks has generally remained unchanged, with pro-inflationary factors prevailing. In the first place, these are risks associated with the labor market and inflation expectations. As to disinflationary factors, this is the risk of a more considerable slowdown in lending. The principal area of uncertainty is the external environment, as its further changes might have both pro-inflationary and disinflationary effects. Pro-inflationary factors include growing protectionism. A disinflationary effect is possible if geopolitical tension eases and sentiment in financial markets improves sustainably. Winding up, I would like to comment on our future decisions. Further developments are highly uncertain, including external conditions as the reason. We can see that market participants' expectations and sentiment are affected by the revision of their assumptions about a possible improvement of geopolitical conditions. Nevertheless, we build our monetary policy on sustained trends, fundamental factors, solid facts, and a conservative approach to risk assessment. It is crucial to stick to this approach to confidently bring inflation back to 4% in 2026, regardless of further external developments. According to our estimates, current inflation trends require a long period of maintaining tight monetary conditions. If we need to raise the key rate to be able to return inflation to the target, we will be ready to do this, although the probability of such a move has decreased. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Now, colleagues, your questions. Do not forget to introduce yourself and identify your agency. Maria in the first row, please. Good afternoon, Maria Stepanova, TASS agency. Was there a discussion for the reduction of the rate apart from other options? And when are we to see the cycle whereby the rate is going to be down? No, we did not discuss lowering the rate today, and to expect the start of it going down is when we will be sure, and it will be manifested, that the inflation is going down sustainably and at the speed which will enable us to bring the inflation down back to 4% in 2026. Ivan, in the second row, please. Ivan Schligin, Formag Ru. I get an impression, if one is to read the analytics, that somehow your decision about the 21% created all the necessary conditions for the inflation to move down to the target. And as you said, in 2026, this target is going to be accomplished. Now, if one is to simplify it, then the 21% may last until 2026. Is it not an oversimplification? Is there anything else that one should comment upon? Or is it true that we can perceive it this way as well? Thank you. It all depends upon situation evolve, because we truly see the current inflation pressure subsiding, but it is happening due to, again, sustainable factors as well as some one-off factors. So we need to make sure that inflation is sustainable in its decline. Now, if the pro-inflationary risks manifest that we see, then the rate may need to be raised further. We're finding ourselves in a situation of sufficient uncertainty. Our current vision is that the tightness in the monetary terms is sufficient, but if there is a need, we would be ready to raise the rate. And our forecast of the average rate for this year, it reflects both options. If the situation evolves in a certain way, the rate can be brought down, but it can be raised as well. Our range is 19.22%, considering the averages. Thank you. Anna, in the row before the last one. Good afternoon. We are all feeling quite joyous to see the ruble appreciating, but at the same time, I've got the following question. In various commercial banks' branches, the ruble and US dollar prices oftentimes are very different from the one that the central bank establishes in the interbank market. Could you please tell us whether the central bank is planning possibly to set some kind of maximum limits to the exchange rate that the commercial banks are quoting? No, we don't have such plans, and we believe that it would be better not to meddle with the mechanisms the way the banks follow to set this exchange rate, because it may end up them not really finding it attractive and they won't be able to meet the demand. But I would like to comment that the exchange rates in the street exchanges have always been different from the interbank exchange rates, on the basis of which the official rate is set. And after, which was in 2022, the wholesale FX supplies into our country stopped. These exchange rate differences indeed grew. One other point that one should pay attention to, these spreads usually grow during the period of high volatility. Once this volatility goes down, the spreads also contract. So the narrowing of the spreads is promoting competition between the banks. So that's the kind of situation we see. But in terms of there being any special measures that we should undertake in order to interfere into the pricing and regulate pricing is something that we don't intend to do. All right, colleagues. Jana. Good afternoon. Jana Churochkina, RIA Novosti, Elvira Nabiullina. I would like to ask you, right now, the rate stays as is, and it has been so for a continuous period of time. However, lately, as well as based on the central bank data, we see that the banks have started bringing down their deposit rates. What do you think is the reason to it? Because in December, the average weighted rates in deposit, again based on the central bank data, were 22.8. Right now, they're just a little bit over 20. So how can you explain it? When deposit rates are above the key rate, overall, this is very much not a standard setup. I would say that we have rather gone back to a normal correlation between the deposit rates and the key rate. Now, the deposit rates higher, the key one in November, December, were because the banks expected further tightening of the monetary environment by the central bank, a further raising of the key rate. Another factor hanging over it was the toughening of our macroprudential policies but after the market players' expectations changed with regard to the key rate, we noticed that these spreads narrowed, and again this narrowing occurred because we had corrected the schedule for the liquidity standards for the banks. So we believe that the current situation is basically normal, as they say. Next question comes online from Igor Vasilyev, the Soviet Chuvashia newspaper in the city of Cheboksary. Hello. Could you please tell us what is the way that the central bank is coordinating its policy of the key rate? Is there any support that you see, from the government and in terms of the economic development support? Yes, the central bank is making up its mind about the key rate independently on its own, but both the central bank and the government, we both work in order to make sure that the economy is developing sustainably, that the well-being of the people is growing, and certainly we maintain continuous contact with the government, exchanging information and forecasts. But we've got our own tasks and the tools kits, and so we make decisions independently, as I said. Now, to implement the national development goals, the government has its toolkit, like regulatory measures, reducing the administrative barriers, structural barriers. Another powerful tool is the fiscal system, the budget, because via the budget stimulus, the government is capable of supporting important industries and companies, decides about how to improve productivity. So you definitely see that the application of it has become more active. Now, the monetary policy that the central bank pursues is aimed at the demand side, because our task is to regulate the demand in such a way so that it complies or conforms to the way the economic industrial output capacity is growing, so as not to let it transform into, active price hiking. We see that it is slightly separated from it, so we need to work in such a way so that the supply catches up, so that both sides of the economy work, at a pace to avoid inflation growing. Now, speaking about the coordination with the government, I should say that for this year we have planned to reduce the budget deficit and a more reserved approach to the subsidized program, because we feel that it will help to hold the demand back as well as inflation. Colleagues, Sergei, in the last row, please. Sergei Bolotov, the Russian Gazette. The Bank of Russia traditionally is paying strong attention to inflationary expectation amongst the households and companies. Could you please tell us whether one can anchor inflation expectations of the households towards the central bank's target of 4% a year after such a strong volatility of the ruble that we have been observing over the last few months? Well, of course, the exchange rate does impact inflationary expectation. This is an important factor that does it, but inflation expectations do not follow automatically in the wake of the exchange rate. There are other factors. People are paying attention to the price tags in the shops. There are certain product markers, as we used to say, that people are cognizant of when developing their own perception as to what kind of price growth they should expect. We do see that the exchange rate volatility, regrettably, currently, because of the sanctional restrictions, is stronger than it was in 2022. And if we talk not even about the exchange rate dynamics, but about the volatility, this is not the kind of the factor which would be conducive to inflation expectations going down. But what I would like to underscore, the lower is inflation, the more stable is the exchange rate. Therefore, when we achieve a stable low inflation, that will work for the good of the stabilizing the exchange rate. Mr. Zabotkin will say something. Sergei, you are certainly correct that the strong exchange rate volatility complicates the stabilization of inflation expectations. But I would like to tell you that if you take a look at the exchange rate dynamics, not through the lens of 3 or 4 weeks in terms of the time frame, or 3 months, but through the last year's dynamics, then the exchange ruble, US dollar and yuan rate is somewhere about at the same place where it used to be in the summer last year. So to say that there has happened a certain systemic depreciation or appreciation of the ruble is premature, because the exchange rate, due to significant fluctuations brought around by very fast changing external conditions, is comparatively stable. Colleagues, please, Oleg. Good afternoon. Oleg Sapushkov, Kommersant. I wanted to ask you the following thing. You were telling us about the budget system impact and the advance funding for the government contract. Now, to what extent these are significant factors for the central bank, and does the central bank discuss with the government to limit this advance funding, and also when this effect is going to dissipate, speaking about the second quarter as applied to the budget spending? Thank you very much for your question. I would say that there are several aspects to this. In fact, if you look short term, the shift in budget spending and such a fast allocation of funds may make an additional positive contribution into inflation. But if we talk about a mid-term inflation trajectory, and more important to us as the process, not how spending is working out within a calendar year, but whether the budget is going to be performed, whether the budget deficit is going to stay at the level that it had been planned for. I mean, the overall structural budget deficit, because in our forecasts and making our estimate of the inflation forecast, we come from an understanding that this year budget will generate disinflationary effect because structural deficit remains. So, to discuss with the government to give up on the advance financing is something that is not worth doing. Moreover, it is necessary in order to support the development of certain industries and companies. You also need to bear in mind that the demand in the economy starts shaping up not when specific money is being made available, but when government contracts are entered into and the companies receive, given the right to start spending that money, understanding that the budget will pay them. But once they start executing the government contracts, then this demand amasses. So we do take into account these short-term effects. But as I said, it is very important for us to see that the Ministry of Finance adheres to its core targets to bring the budget deficit down to zero towards the end of this year. Mr. Zabotkin, something that Elvira Nabiullina mentioned in her statement, and what she just mentioned, this advance funding of the budget spending. I mean, the reverse side to it, I mean, the flip side, which is something that you also anticipate in the wording of your question, a lesser need among businesses to raise loans. So in terms of the aggregate demand, it actually doesn't produce an impact because the aggregate demand is defined by the overall budget spending and the corporate plans to procure services and products within the government contract. But on the monetary side, this advance payment is the flip side of a slower growth in corporate lending. So at a first glance, this really doesn't affect the inflation forecast. Thank you. The next question comes online from Evgenia Pismenaya, Bloomberg. Eugenia, please. Good afternoon. Recently, the presidential decision was published to allow an American hedge fund to buy the shares of certain Russian companies. Regrettably, the authorities didn't disclose any comments. Why, after several years when it hasn't been possible, it is right now that Russia made it possible from the hedge funds from unfriendly countries to buy into the Russian securities? And what is the amount of money in question? And generally speaking, do you observe any growing interest on the part of the non-residents to start investing into the Russian market? Well, as far as specific transactions and the money involved in them is concerned, we're not commenting on it because the decision about it is being made by the president based on the economic rationale. But in as far as the non-resident interest is concerned towards Russian assets, we do not have the authentic data that we can rely upon, which could point towards this interest being material, although as a subject it is being discussed and quite broad. I mean, there is a reason behind it. Rate differential, different indicators in terms of the viability of investing into such assets abroad and in Russia. But certain sanctions and other restrictions imposed upon the capital flow are still there. But we'll definitely monitor this as information emerges. Thank you. Other contacts, please. Marina? Marina Pimenova, NTV Business News. What I've noticed is that the longer the key rate is at a high point, more memes and various, satirical videos appear like you are coming to your alumni meeting in school. So what's your take on it? Positive in terms of how the monetary policy may be negatively described or negatively? Well, I mean, jokes are good things, and I'm quite okay about it, particularly when jokes really make one laugh. That's absolutely okay. Anastasia in the second row, please. Anastasia Savelyeva, Interfax Agency. How stable are the trends that you see in lending? Is it not the kind of factor that is worrying you like it used to in the past? Because you used to say that macroprudentials are not about lending, but more about the stability and capital. Because many banks are saying that they will struggle to maintain the capital adequacy this year. Are you not currently considering the possibility of softening certain markups? Maybe it's about time to think about not to raise the anti-cyclical markup in July. With regard to the stability of the trends in lending that we observe, the basic slowdown is in the retail segment, and I think it has been taking place since November last year, if I'm not mistaken. So the trend there is quite stable. And as far as the corporate lending is concerned, which is something that I've mentioned already, we see that the pace and the rates have become much more moderate compared to the very high ones in last year, but the data is very much blurred, very much noisy, because of this advance payments from the budget system. So in terms of the sustainable trends in the corporate lending, we will be able to confidently say something about it only once we have the second quarter data in our hands. Now, and as far as the capital adequacy is concerned and macroprudential measures, yes, we do apply macroprudential regulation indeed, in order not to accumulate the risks in the banks, trying to de-incentivize such lending and make sure the additional capital buffers are created. But in terms of there being any systemic reduction of such markups, this is not what we plan, even if the lending pace is more blurred. I mean, but as far as the anti-cyclical markup is concerned, we're going to monitor the situation. But in terms of our plans to change our plans, no, we don't have them yet. Particularly since we believe that there's kind of an anti-cyclical markup in quiet times, even when there's no overheating, it should be positive in terms of serving as the buffer on the way for the capital, banking capital to grow uncontrollably. Elvira Nabiullina, Money Doesn't Sleep channel. You mentioned that there's a strong demand for federal bonds, government bonds. We see it in the way the indices are growing, and also the market players are noting that the non-resident companies are actively interested in the Russian stock market. And in the last report, which was the Financial Market Review, non-residents are already participating in the Minister of Finance auctions to buy bonds. But if one is to anticipate that such a positive perception towards geopolitical risk is premature, and there could be a certain apathy or a certain disappointment among the non-residents, may there not arise risks when there would be an active outflow amongst non-residents from it, which would negatively impact the Russian market? At this point in time, we do not see such risk. If there is an interest like that, it hasn't yet expressed itself in any large scales. I mean, although I can't say that we have full data. So, principally speaking, we do not see any risks to the financial stability in the growing demand for the government bonds, because we do acknowledge that this is the kind of demand both in the primary market and in the secondary exchange trading is something that involves a broad set of players, the banks, institutional private investors. And so this interest has been conditioned not only by the expectations in the area of geopolitics, but the first manifestations, first indicators surfacing about the slowdown of inflation expectations. So a certain adjustment may well take place, but we do not see any big risks here. Thank you. The next question comes from online from Denis Yalachowski. Denis, please. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I've got two questions, if I may. In today's statement, it says that the deviation of the Russian economy from the moderate growth trajectory is quite substantial. But in terms of this balanced growth, what is the opinion of the Bank of Russia? How far it deviates? Is there a gap in terms of the GDP percentages? How we can put our finger on it? Is how going to change throughout the year? Maybe I'm planning in a systemic way to share that view. And my second question, do you think that it will be probable for an extraordinary board meeting if there is some progress in the Ukrainian negotiations and a certain settlement agreement is going to be signed that is going to be satisfactory to both parties? So if you allow for such a possibility of an extraordinary board meeting, so how the key rate may change? Well, as to the first question, gap provisions, well, on multiple occasions, we mentioned that it is very difficult to measure it, so we don't come up with any estimates. The indicator of the gap of issue is the inflation dynamics. So effectively, that is something that describes the overheating or cooling. I mean, the inflation is above our target, and that is the indicator proving that the gap remains. But simply because the current inflation expectations are lowering, that may testify to the fact that gradually the gap is narrowing. Now, and as far as the extraordinary board meetings is concerned, I mean, that's exactly why they're called extraordinary, because nobody expects them to take place. So there's nothing else to add to it. But in terms of there being any prerequisites, for that, for yet another meeting or extraordinary meeting, no, we don't see it. Please, Mr. Zabotkin. All of the decisions that one can make based on the information available at this point in time have been made at today's meeting. Yes, dear colleagues, Elizaveta in the third row. Elizaveta Marskaya, Russia 24. Elvira Nabiullina, the U.S. is saying that they are close to lifting sanctions from Russia. So what's your expectation in terms of how it may affect the defreezing of the Russian assets? I mean, generally speaking, I believe it's too early to discuss it because I'm not aware of any specific action or any even preliminary decision-making process about it. Rita, please. Margarita Mordovina, RBK. On March 18th, when Vladimir Putin spoke over the phone to Donald Trump, we noted that in the Russian stock market, the evening trading session demonstrated two very strong hikes. First, the index jumped very high, then very quickly went down. Is the central bank monitoring that? Don't you see the need to analyze it in terms of various manipulations or speculations or undue practices? And generally speaking, in the current news background, don't you feel there are maybe certain risks in terms of the more liquid morning sessions, evening sessions, and respectively the weekend sessions? We do not see risks. We are continuously monitoring this situation. As far as the first part of your question is concerned, we are analyzing the situation, and if facts of undue behavior are detected, we will take measures because we have instruments to that. We cannot confirm that all the sales came from one player because what you see as a the so-called spike in terms of the exchange trading charts means that there was just an activation within a certain period of time. It doesn't point to there being just one entity behind it. Colleagues, Vladimir, please, Reuters. Thank you very much. Vladimir Soldatin from Reuters. Could you please tell us, what are the possible options that you reviewed today about the key rate? And my additional question, how do you think appreciation of the ruble, may it be a risk to the federal budget? Well, usually the question about different options on the table to decide on the key rate is the first one asked. I guess the situation is quite obvious to you. We, discussed just one option, but it took our time to discuss what was the signal that was out there to it. Now, in terms of the exchange rate appreciation, in order for the exchange rate to be impactful, it has to be sustainable. Now, in terms of sustainability in the exchange rate, it's very premature to see it like that. As far as the budget is concerned, it's for the Minister of Finance to say, because you need to take a look at the aggregate effect in terms of the spending and income, because if essentially ruble appreciation against all things, with all things being equal, is disinflationary. If there is a sustainable appreciation of the ruble, with all other things being equal, it also may mean the softening of the monetary policy and the reduction of the interest payments for the budget. So in terms of the budget, you need to analyze different channels of influence. On our part, as the central bank, in the first place, we analyze the exchange rate dynamics impact on inflation. But as I have already put it, if this is sustainable ruble appreciation, that is a disinflationary factor, but in the meantime, it is premature to talk about it like this. The next question comes online from Maria Korogot. The Kursk Pravda, the Kursk Truth. Maria, please. The city of Kursk, the Kursk Pravda, Maria Korogot. In the media, there is speculation saying that many foreign brands are planning to make a comeback to the Russian market. Most probably that might affect the supply of goods and services, and pro-inflationary influence may go down. My question is, has the Bank of Russia taken this into account when making decisions about the key rate? If positive, can one believe this is one of the preconditions for the monetary policy to be softened? Thank you. Thank you. No. We did not account for this factor because, in the meantime, this is only a hypothetical probability. But it is true that the foreign trade conditions improving in a systemic, sustainable way, then the lower import costs generate disinflationary effect. But the important caveat here is that not only imports, but also exports ought to expand, because if only imports grow while exports remain the same, that would lead to the depreciation of the exchange rate in ruble, which again will act as the price growth factor. I shall repeat that the scenario that you have just described, we consider hypothetical. In our forecast scenarios, we follow the notion that the sanctional pressure shall remain at the current level. But once there is a material indication of any change, we will revisit this and will reconsider many things, including the key rate future. Invest Future. Recently, we learned that the Bank of Russia supported the cryptocurrency trading, but only for super qualified investors. So it's interesting to know why the regulator changed its approach to it, and what's your attitude counter to the fact that the normal individuals do have access to trading cryptocurrencies at the foreign exchanges. Well, now, overall, our attitude towards cryptocurrencies hasn't strongly changed. We do continue to believe that these are very volatile instruments, often used for non-transparent transactions, but we believe that the time has come to make yet another step towards developing a regulatory environment in order to make it possible for well-qualified investors to invest into cryptocurrencies in the Russian market. But why well-qualified investors? Because we think that such investments are wrought with strong risks. So we suggest that this should be done as part of the experiment, which would enable to establish standards, to improve transparency, and simultaneously assess the due process for qualified investors to get access to it, and whether anything needs to be changed in terms of this special regime. So we continue to adhere to our old position that cryptocurrency must not be accepted as the means of payment, as a legal tender for payments. So we stand by our restriction to use cryptocurrencies between the legal entities, but also to establish liability for such a prohibition being offended. Nikita Mitrofanov, Economical Telegram Channel. To begin with, I would like to note that Mr. Zabotkin's observations really paid well, because on March 15th, the prices for flowers went down back to normal. My second question, you said that in the base scenario, the Russian economics are going to be close to the soft landing. Could you possibly describe the design of this soft landing? Is it low inflation or the tough monetary policy? The industry is not in the crisis. Unemployment is not growing. Well, indeed, this is a very notable reduction of inflation down to 4% to target in 2026 if the positive rates of growth sustain. I shall remind you that this year we expect the GDP rate growth to be at between 1% to 2%, which we believe is the soft landing scenario. Colleagues, Natalia? Thank you. Natalia Trushina, Moscow Komsomolets newspaper, economic department, economic desk. You said that in the basic scenario you keep sanctional pressure, but due to the warming in the Russian-US relations, we hear it from every corner, even at the highest level, that it is possible that the sanctions may be lifted on the American side. And with this in mind, possible lifting of sanctions against the Moscow exchange is expected, and within the next 9 to 12 months, US dollar is going to be again trading, and the MasterCard and Visa are going to be coming back. Now, over this more extended period, period of time, the central bank, does it think that it can be possible? If so, if it all comes true, how that might impact the financial systems because of the previous course taken towards de-dollarization of the Russian economy? Thank you. Well, I guess I shall repeat what I've already mentioned. This scenario, as the one which we keep in our mind when making our decisions, we're ready to consider it only if there is already materialization of this scenario, that there is a solid ground for us to believe that it happens. So it's not going to be hypothetical anymore. It's going to be becoming a real something. Now, from the point of view of how that may impact a financial system, yeah, I mean, if it comes true, that will be a disinflationary factor. Now, in as far as our de-dollarization policy is concerned, actually, we launched it even before all these sanctions were imposed, because we overall believe that the hard currency, foreign exchange risk on the financial system should be softened, should be cushioned as far as the international payment systems are concerned. We're not against the competition with international payment systems, but this is again our strategic course that we started following many years ago, aimed at developing our own competitive national payment infrastructure, and we're not going to steer away from it. Thank you. Next question comes online. Elena Lozovaya, Vestnik magazine from Rostov-on-Don. Yes, good afternoon, Elvira Nabiullina. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I have a question about the standard to protect the rights and legal interests of mortgage borrowers, which came into force this year. This is indeed a very important document in order to make mortgage lending more transparent, but some experts express concern that this may reduce availability of housing and consequently lead to an even stronger cooling in the real estate market. How strong are such risks, do you believe? This is my first question. And my second question, this particular mortgage standard, are there any plans to introduce it as a compulsory one? Thank you. This standard, we believe, is indeed a very important one, the mortgage standard that we have been working on together with the marketplace for a long period of time. As one of its significant elements, it prohibits the fees that the developer pays to the bank to include into the housing price, because that reduces transparency, that confuses the buyers, and so then it makes buyers procure the housing at an exaggerated price. Based on what we see, there are about 5 to 7% of it like that in the primary market. So speaking about your concerns, if these schemes go, and we hope that they will, that would mean substantial decline in the mortgage demand. In the primary market, 90% of the mortgage lending is being made available under the government-sponsored programs where the rate is low without it. But we do understand that the banks and developers as well may stimulate sales resorting to different schemes. But what we're against is to legalize such schemes or to delay the introduction of the mortgage standards, because we are principally against supporting the mortgage demand for housing at the expense of reducing the protection of the rights and interests of the borrowers. We believe it is unacceptable. We said it more than once. Just imagine that somebody will have to buy his apartment that he had bought with an exaggerated price tag, but he need to, get rid of it in order to cover his debt, the mortgage debt. So it's inconceivable. Now, responding to a second part of the question, this standard is already a mandatory one for the banks. It's a different matter that the sanctions against the violation of this standard are not yet applicable, because it's a supervisory prudential standard, including the sanctions, will come into effect as of April 1st. The sanctions themselves may seem to be soft, because what we're talking about is that the name of the bank will be published on the website. That will send a signal to the consumers. But if such violations become systemic and we see that sanctions don't work, we will toughen regulation. we already stated that we want to introduce this product, which is a standard mortgage loan, which will be fully transparent to people. People will see what is the rate. It is a fixed rate, the clear schedule of payments, and with regard to all of the mortgage loans which would not be complying to this standard, we will impose higher requirements upon the banks in terms of the capital adequacy and others in order to really incentivize them with the ruble, so to say, in order to make everything transparent. But we will start monitoring it very, very closely once this supervisory standard comes into effect. Good afternoon. Evgeny Ryabkov, Bitcoin project. Could you please tell us, if by the next board meeting, let's say, the ruble exchange rate remains strong, would it be justified to assess it as a sustainable phenomenon? Well, I mean, the fact that the ruble may remain strong in itself may not allow us to say that this is 100% sustainable trend. In order to understand this trend within the FX real as a sustainable one needs to first make sure that changes the external conditions which originally led to this exchange rate being stable is sustainable. The external conditions, I mean, Mr. Zabotkin, please. Just to underscore it, this is basically the kind of thought which, in the concluding part of the official statement read by Elvira Nabiullina, basically meant it that way in order to say that the external conditions have changed. They need to change first. But right now, the market is simply, reflecting the expectations of their future change. Anastasia, in the second row, please. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Anastasia Bashkartova, Independent Gazette. My question is this. On the part of the businesses, one can hear now more and more often the kind of statement that the high key rate is subduing the growth because of inflation, but simultaneously with that, businesses are saying that the high key rate provokes inflation on the supply side in terms of the loans and interest rates and so on and so forth. So could you please tell us, are there any figures that you can quote so what can one understand how much the key rate eats out of inflation because of subdued demand, and on the contrary, how much it adds in terms of the interest costs, how that correlation looks like? Well, thank you very much indeed for the question. You're quite right. Businesses are speaking about it very often. These kinds of simple calculus could have been presented if any company would find it very easy to translate its cost into prices, including the interest payment, but not only that. And then we would be in a position to say that this part in the price growth comes from the interest payments, but in real life, it practically never happens. So I suppose that based on this kind of an assumption that a business may translate into a price any growing interest payment is being resorted by those who state that the high key rate speeds up inflation. This is not really the case, because it is true that the companies are not able to automatically translate costs, any sort of cost, into pricing. They can do that only to the extent that the demand allows them to. For different goods and services, this transition can be very, very different. If the price demand is very low in terms of its elasticity, for example, like a product that a human being is consuming every day, like what is being eaten, the simplest one, I mean, the elasticity there is not that big, but a lot depends there upon competition. I mean, those who can afford to reduce prices similarly can afford to expand their market share and not necessarily translate all of the costs into prices. So this translation of interest rates into prices is far from being complete. What really is pointing to it that the very same businesses at times are saying exactly the opposite things. Because of the high rates, their profit and free cash flow go down. I mean, if they could translate everything into the prices, there wouldn't be any complaints or grievances coming from them. on the matter. Now, in fact, to separate these two effects, of course, it would be quite desirable, we understand, by some. It is impossible. Our model estimations and our forecast estimations, certainly we do pay attention to the cost factor, but we take an integral look at the aggregate impact that such interest rates generate upon the price dynamics. Another thing that I would like to mention is that the demand channel, it is much stronger than the cost channel. So the general effect from the key rates growth and inflation, certainly it's diminishing impact upon inflation in step by step. We know that this question periodically is being raised. We did run some survey in terms of what businesses seen in costs and the interest rates, but this is the data that we had before 2023. Clearly, as far as 2024 is concerned, this is the year of high rates, and we will have the data in our hands and we would update our understanding sometime by summer, right? Yes. Colleagues, please, Ekaterina. Right. Good afternoon, Ekaterina Litova, Vedomosti. Following up on what businesses think, do you know the slowdown in businesses' investment activity and the reduction of the business profitability, specifically against the background of them being so worried that their manufacturing processes might stop and they won't be able to develop their investment projects? Well, we have certain data that is a bit of a delayed in terms of the nature and the investment data. In terms of the preliminary data that we can see, the investment activity in Q1 is at the level of the Q4. So there's no speaking about the subsiding investment activity. Understandably, in the first place, the businesses would be finishing the investment programs that they had previously launched. We can see it. Everybody does it, but there are certain review of the investment plans with a certain postponement. We see that it is taking place, but nevertheless, the level of investment activity shall remain relatively high. Why? Because the basic resource to fund investments, that's the way it used to be and will be companies' own money resources. Loans, they take up a much smaller share in investment funding sources, while the financial result or the company's profits was quite substantial over the previous years. Even the last year, despite certain profit levels nudging down, it turned out to be quite high historically. That is why the loan sources of funding are available, and we've always been telling companies that you must more actively access capital markets and raise not only debt funding from the banks, but also debt funding from non-banking institutions and equity funding as well. Thank you. Next question comes online from Daria Kuskova, Business News Agency from St. Petersburg. Please. Elvira Nabiullina, good afternoon. My question is this. Some Russian companies delayed their plans to do IPOs, citing the reason the high key rate. When do you believe they will be able to go back to their plans? And generally speaking, when one may expect IPO boom to come back to this market? Thank you. Yes, indeed, the issues are interested to sell their share once the market is bullish. Actually, the stock market is currently growing, but throughout the second half of last year, it has been bearish, and that has been deterring potential investment to come to this market. And of course, the growing key rate definitely, quenches, subsides the interest towards IPO. But this is a temporary period, and I would like to draw attention to the fact that before the key rate started rising, some described it as the IPO booming. I mean, in terms of the quantities of them, it was a big one, but major corporates very rarely went for an IPO, for the capital market, for its development, for its proper scale and long-term investments. Different other factors are important apart apart from the key rate, changes in the corporate governance, that the companies that want to go to the capital market need to be ready for this, as, protecting the rights of minorities and law-abiding investors. That all influences the ability of the company to really go after it. We're also aware that the government is currently discussing these issues and how to attract more companies. And indeed, we should incentivize this market to take off. But for that purpose, we need major issues to join it. Thank you. Colleagues, please, are there any more questions? Julia, please. Good afternoon. Yulia Rastorguyeva, market power. What is the way that the Bank of Russia assesses the unevenness of business activity between the private sector and the companies which have access to subsidized funding and government contract? Is it growing or is it going down? I mean, the differences are really growing. Principally speaking, the business level of activity differs, first of all, in different industries and sectors, because we're currently going through the structural economic transformation period. Some industries were able to gain a real impetus for their development, specifically the ones where you have a lot of import substitution, where various niches have been vacated after foreign companies left. In other industries, there is a slowdown. Now, talking about the importance of the subsidized funding and the role of the government contract, yes, indeed, such mechanisms do create opportunities to the industries and the businesses that receive them. That is quite obvious. And so two points are important here. First is for the government support and the subsidized funding and program not to end up in the market overheating, like it used to be in the housing market during the period when the mortgage funding didn't have any specific system to it. And secondly, the structural transformation in the economy without the government support is something that is very difficult to accomplish, but most importantly is for that government support to be made available to the industries which create the economic growth in terms of the supply economics. So if the supply economic and its potential are going to grow faster, then against all other things being equal, that would also mean the decline of the inflationary pressure. Thank you, colleagues. Nikita. Nikita Prokofiev, Pro Finance Agency. I've got a question about the family mortgage. We've spoken about it already previously, but my question is this. The banks continue, even now, to behave improperly towards the companies who come for family in a mortgage. They hike up the price of the housing, impose different fees, because the central bank previously stated that it is trying to regulate this market. Could you please tell us, will it be regulating these specific issues that the borrowers are having difficulties with? Well, currently, this specific part of it, which is the payment, is not being regulated within the mortgage standard. Now, in order to really curb such schemes with these fees, we're working with the Committee on Standards to impose additional restrictions into the mortgage standard. What I would like to draw attention to is that the mortgage standard itself is really something that we discussed with the marketplace for a very long period of time. I feel that there is an opportunity to bring around quicker decision, because currently subsidized programs do not rule out the possibility to have a fee structure in it. But what we're talking with the Committee on Standards is that the subsidized mortgage can only be used within the lending arrangement that exclude such fees, and that would be a much quicker way to deal with it. Thank you. Lyuba, next one. Good afternoon. Lyubov Mikhailova, Expert magazine. The United States looks like it's very close to really create its Federal Reserve on the cryptocurrency, because we previously had heard about such appeals from the central banks in Japan and other countries. What is the attitude of the central bank to it? Is it possible to imagine that the cryptocurrency reserve is something that Russia would also need? Well, first of all, the attitude towards the reserves of the country which is itself is issuing reserve currency in other countries is really a difference. Because to us, the quality of the reserve currency is very important, like liquidity, minimum susceptibility to the credit and market risks, so that in a crisis situation you can quickly utilize it without any strong loss of value. And so the terms and conditions under which the cryptocurrency may end up being in our reserves, I don't see them just yet. Thank you very much, colleagues. Mikhail? Mikhail Moiseyev, Frank Media. In your today's press release, the central bank sent a signal by such a wording that it will consider the possibility of raising the key rate if the disinflationary dynamics is not going to be sufficient. What does it mean? Will it change the essence of the signal, or it remains the same, moderately tight? Has there been any other options that the central bank considered? We considered two kinds of signal, neutral and moderately tight. Yes, indeed, we slightly changed the wording in order to more precisely reflect our vision, i.e. that we're going to consider the possibility of raising the key rate in case disinflation is not demonstrating the kind of pace, not stably as we wanted it to. We previously stated that we will review it over the subsequent or forthcoming board meetings, so we conditioned it this time. Evgeny, in the last row, please. Hello, Evgeny Mirachov, Izvestia newspaper. Could you please tell me? I've got two questions. Have the central bank considered the possibility of very precise toughening of the monetary conditions with the help of macroprudential policy in the beginning of the cycle and the reduction of the key rate? In other words, are you allowing the possibility during the board meetings to reduce the rate earlier or to toughen it? And my second question, you said that the ruble exchange rate, there's a lot of talk about the geopolitics and its impact on the exchange of the ruble. Could you please tell us how specifically you do take into account of the geopolitical factors in your agenda? Do you do that, or it doesn't depend upon the de-escalation perspectives and it depends upon exclusively the facts and the results of such a de-escalation? Thank you. As far as the board meeting reviewing the key rate is concerned, and specifically the possibility of applying other macroprudential measures, categorically not. We keep this instrument separate. Our macroprudential measures, markups and limitations are all aimed at holding back the accumulation of risks in the financial institutions and the borrowers. Yes, such measures may impact and do impact the lending rate growth. And we take this into account in our monetary policy as a fact, like we do reflect the inflation expectations, the dynamics of the current inflation, but in some way to intentionally bring macroprudential measures to suit to somehow compensate the necessary decision in the key rate. Categorically no. We believe that one shouldn't confuse this instrument. One should mix up the aims for which they're being applied. And macroprudential measures, this is not a monetary policy measure. As far as geopolitics are concerned, without doubt, we do take into account all of the external factors, geopolitics and the way the global economy develops, because in the global economy there are very serious changes taking place with the growing protection, not only in terms of the intentions. We already see it as facts, as actual results. We used to take into account, and will continue to take into account, changes in the geopolitics as the factor which generates impact upon our decisions, as long as these are actual things and these are sustainable things, stable things, and we will see that there is a stable effect generated upon our decisions. Why is it important to us? Because we ought to provide for the inflation reduction down to target in any scenario, including the one within which status quo in geopolitics remains. The monetary policy, which is aiming for it, will definitely reach low inflation within a more favorable scenario. We keep it in mind, but we also need to be able to attain this outcome within a less favorable scenario, so we make our decisions within the current framework, as long as this scenario doesn't become the baseline, because within our baseline scenario, the level of sanctional pressure remains, as I said. Dear colleagues, are there any questions remaining? Grigori, I guess this is going to be the last one. Yes, good afternoon, Grigory Barjan of Popular Economics blog. I have two questions. The first one, considering your decisions, you are saying that the inflation expectations among the households and businesses have gone down, and then you are writing about the analysts who slightly raised their inflation expectations for 2026. Don't you believe that this particular review is the result of, them relying upon the Bank of Russia forecast, which was published last year? And my second question is methodological, because I thought that I could raise it particularly since there were questions about memes in the internet. So my question is this: to what extent it would be worthwhile that the Bank of Russia may believe to switch to the price index, which calls for dynamic weights rather than the way it is currently being done, when these weights are static throughout the year, following the example of the Federal Reserve System? Well, thank you very much. With your permission, I would answer the question on inflation expectations, and Mr. Zabotkin will help me, and then I would ask him to answer the second question. Well, inflation expectations of households and professional analysts can change in different directions, because we've witnessed this in the past. Because right now, inflation expectations between the households and businesses went down. The inflation expectations amongst the analysts have grown, but just a little bit, 0.2% for 2026. But at the same time, these inflation expectations remain considerably lower than the expectations of the households. Now, whether analysts account for in their inflation expectation changes of our forecast, I believe that they do. Similarly, in terms of the expectations that they produce or they have in terms of the key rate path that they read out from us, many of them use their own modeling, and that is why actually what we find important is to do this survey on the eve of the key rate board meeting to question macro analysts in order to see what the professional experts in the area are thinking. Mr. Zabotkin? Right. Grigory, thank you very much for your question. We have thoroughly studied the index on the basis of which one should do the target setting for the inflation targeting as part of the monetary review that we completed last year. There was a separate article dedicated to it. So the conclusions that you can see there haven't changed since then. I would simply remind you again that indeed there is a unique case of the Federal Reserve System, which uses the consumer spending deflator, while the rest of the central banks, without any exception, that do inflation targeting, use the consumer price index. And that is explained by the fact that the consumer price index is published earlier, and it is a simpler one to calculate rather than the consumer spending deflator. It is not being reconsidered retrospectively as opposed to the consumer spending deflator. In the prevalent number of countries, the consumer spending deflator is being calculated not on a monthly but on a quarterly basis along with the rest of the GDP statistics. So, in terms of the aggregation of such facts, the common practice is to use consumer price index. Well, an important comment to this discourse is that sometimes one hears such a speculation that maybe if one is to change the index that we use to measure, inflation might look lower. Yes, indeed. In the case of a deflator, simply because of methodology that produces it, the consumer spending deflator is lower than the consumer price index. Like in the case of the US, where the inflation is lower, the difference on average is, half a percentage point annualized. In a long period of time. But that doesn't mean, that only means that based on the actual results, the Federal Reserve targets the consumer price index at the level of 2%. If you change the indicator, then respectively you will have to adjust the target level of inflation in order for the pace of inflation that the economy is showing. If you reach it, in the end of the day, will remain the same, irrespective of what kind of index you use, like the mileage in the car. You can have it in miles or in kilometers, but you will drive the same distance, and you will see various, speed limits on the signage along the highway. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Yeah, have a good weekend, and